の気持ちは大事にすることにしたから。大事なものは拾うんだ。僕、超能力者なんだ。
No, no, this is not the beginning of the story of Mob Psycho 100. No, for that, we're gonna have to go
If everyone is not special, maybe you can't be what you want to be. それぞれの答えにつかる。
Shigeo Kageyama is afraid. This young boy, also referred to as Mob, walks into the Spirits and Such consultation office looking for advice, any advice, from its owner, Reigen Arataka. Mob believes that he has psychic abilities and is terrified that he might hurt people. Reigen is a con man posing as a psychic and first thinks Mob is playing some kind of prank on him. But as he talks and sees the genuine worry in Mob's eyes, he decides that instead of kicking him out of the office or crushing his wild imagination, he sits Mob down and tells him that those powers, real or fake, don't make him any less human. They're a trait of his, like being smart or good at sports, a characteristic to embrace but not obsess over. Because, at the end of the day, the greatest trait of all is kindness. Become a good person, Mob. That is all. And in that moment, without realizing it, Reigen changed the life of Mob, himself and countless others, and set into motion the events that would lead to one of the greatest anime ever created. Mob Psycho is originally a manga by the author One, who also wrote and drew the original One Punch Man. The anime started adaptation in 2016 by Studio Bones and was directed by Yuzuru Tachikawa, and has since become one of the most universally beloved anime of all time, despite not reaching the same notoriety as classic shonen. Its wild and creative animation, its unique and memorable characters, and the absolute love the show gets from its creators has made it one of my favorite shows of all time, and only recently have I gone back to fully relive the story of Mob Psycho and why it still holds up so well half a decade later. But to understand this story of Mob Psycho 100, we must first understand Shigeo Kageyama, not to be confused with Kaguya-sama, video link above, a middle schooler employed by the spirit hunting conman Reigen Arataka, and in his free time helps exorcise spirits around Japan, because Mob actually does have psychic powers, and is quite possibly the strongest esper to ever exist. But Mob doesn't care about psychic powers. They're a part of him, sure, but they only make up a proportion of his characteristics, and most importantly, they don't get him what he truly wants in life, to impress Tsubomi, a childhood crush. And so, Mob has a problem, because for all of his powers, he's not really good at anything else. Mob is, from the outside looking in, a loser. He's not the best student, he's incredibly physically weak, even by middle school standards. He's not stupid, but he is hopelessly good-willed and generally a pushover, avoiding nearly all human confrontation and doing what basically anyone asks of him. He understands people, but fails in common social situations, and his only close friend is said 28-year-old con man he works for at 300 yen an hour, which, Stella, conversion rate please? Holy crap, that's like $2.25 an hour? So even in this case, he's being ripped off. And most troublesome for Mob is that he outwardly shows very little emotion. This is in part due to latent trauma that keeps his emotions in check because they directly correspond with the severity of his psychic power, and if he's not careful, he fears that it will hurt someone. But this fear has directly led Mob to ignore his feelings on most things, and in doing so has become a passive person that people look on with pity and disdain. He has very little agency and little outward desires, and it would have stayed that way too, if not for that fateful meeting, which gave Mob two very important things: a mentor in Reigen, who genuinely cares for and wants Mob to improve, and perspective. Many of the spirits Mob deals with on a day-to-day basis have regrets, situations that made them who they are and not want to move on, and therefore perspective On the faults of life, a living person doesn't. And while those perspectives are often tainted, they force Mob to still ask himself genuine questions. Who am I? Who do I want to be? And what kind of life should I live? Because behind the amazing animation and character work and slice of life style story of Mob Psycho, there is a fascinating discussion about individuality, isolation, the idea of being special, and one of the hardest questions we can ask ourselves: can people change? And should we let them? Mob Psycho is unique in the sense that both the show and its protagonist don't just gloss over this question in the friendship is magical and we should forgive everybody unconditionally sense. Mob Psycho is more than willing to challenge Mob to truly test how kind and forgiving he can be. There's a reason that despite being canonically insanely powerful, there's a common consensus amongst fans to protect Mob at all costs, because Mob is just as Reagan asked him to be, a genuinely good person. And while this is becoming a more common trope in anime protagonists, Mob stands out as not only being genuinely good, but genuinely flawed and unsure of himself. A realistic goodness that can make mistakes and under different circumstances may have been much worse. And we see that flaws of that goodness, the danger Mob puts himself in because he won't compromise his morals, and the consequences of his aversion to using his power on living people. And so the crux of Mob Psycho is not can Mob win the day, but rather what part of himself will change in order to make that happen, and by the end, can Mob still, against all odds, remain a good person? Stella, lights, camera, season 1. Mob is a loser who goes straight home or to work after school, which makes him the perfect target for the Telepathy Club, his first test of change. The club is filled with slackers who need a fifth member to keep their club alive. Of course, a loser like Mob is a perfect fit, so they goad and recruit and try to take advantage of Mob's passiveness, and it almost works. But there's a quirk about Mob, as unlike most anime protagonists, he has a severe case of mild self-awareness that's easily triggered when point-blank asked by student council representatives if joining the slackers in the Telepathy Club is actually what he wants. And thanks to Reagan and a particularly horrific spirit he vaporized earlier in a girl's school, don't ask about it, Mob decides actively and with purpose that the best way to win over Tsubomi is to join the club. The Body Improvement Club, baby. The top chads at Salt Middle School and the best gym bros dude could ask for. But why, you may ask, would this scrawny child join the Body Improvement Club with these chads? Simple. Tsubomi likes him buff. But in all seriousness, Mob correctly identified that Tsubomi is more interested in athletics than telepathy, and because he has instilled in himself a belief that he shouldn't rely on his powers for everything, lest be nothing without them, Mob enthusiastically puts his body through the ringer every day from that point forward, passing out from exhaustion quite often, which probably isn't healthy, but he does it anyway, to improve himself, and he seems happier for it. But change doesn't affect just one aspect of life, it has ripples, and all it takes is this one moment of self-awareness and active choice on Mob's part to start a domino effect. Mob gains real friends for the first time, both from the Body Improvement Club, which I can't stress enough will throw hands for Mob without question, and the Telepathy Club, who, while being slackers, still hang out with Mob afterward and offer Mob an opportunity to be social with other people and have fun outside of work or training. And the funny thing is, neither of them really care about his powers because Mob doesn't either. The Telepathy Club has a passing interest, but even then, they don't focus on it. They like Mob because he is Mob, honest and trusting to a fault. The whole endeavor is a teaching moment for Mob and shows him the benefits of actively following his desires instead of slacking off all day. And there's something incredibly admirable in seeing himself push to the limit, struggling to keep up when he has a built-in cheat code to bypass it all, and he technically has every right to use said cheat code. He can use his powers as he sees fit, they're his powers, but he doesn't want to become conceited to never put effort into the work he does. And that drive, that little push, that, funny enough, the Telepathy Club gives him inadvertently, makes him more confident. That activeness, that hard work is what he wants. But it's not all positive, because the more Mob becomes active in the world around him, the more the rest of the world begins to notice him. And Mob's philosophy, his refusal to take part in the exploitation of his own power, is a threatening thing to see. Mob has an extreme aversion to using his powers to hurt humans. He will exhaust all other options and then some if possible, because of that fear of losing control. And the show has a genius way of illustrating that control with a counter that pops up every time Mob experiences specific emotional moments, and that counts up through multiple episodes towards 100, and signifies a breaking point, an explosion of power that will be colored by whatever emotion Mob faces at that moment. Anger, sadness, animosity, rejection, the anticipation, the fear that each explosion will be one that Mob can't come back from. The first explosion we see is Mob genuinely angry at a cult leader evil spirit named Dimple. Yes, it's a lot to take in, but remember this smug asshole, he's important later. Suggests that he has no emotion and that he should get a clue, which is apparently a very terrible thing to say to someone in Japan. And we see Mob absolutely decimate this spirit, but we're also a bit worried because he fights Dimple in a room filled with innocent brainwashed civilians. But even in his rage, Mob only hurts Dimple, as Dimple is not human, and leaves the rest of the group unharmed, while also unintentionally starting another cult, but don't worry about that. The fight highlights the insecurity Mob has about his lack of social skills and emotional display, and his self-deprecation, a fear that Reagan eventually turns on his head, telling Mob that his lack of awareness led him to outright reject Dimple's mind control and call out the oddness of what some might consider normal social situations, and in doing so, saved a lot of innocent people. But that simple resolution is undercut very quickly with a major turning point in the show. After Mob is kidnapped by a rival middle school through an overly complicated plan by a delinquent to get the Body Improvement Club to fight that school, don't worry about it, Mob is dragged into the showdown with Hanazawa Teruki, a suave ace student, athlete, and champion of the Black Pepper Gang. I think that's correct. Teruki is a very powerful Esper who uses his power unconditionally to get good grades, to get the girls, to get good at sports. Whatever he can use it for, he will. After taking out the Body Improvement Club, Mob confronts him, calling him out on his blatant use of his power, beginning his first real battle. And unlike the one-sidedness of Dimple's fight, this fight is much more brutal, because Dimple was a spirit and Teruki is a human, a distinction that cripples Mob's ability to fight back with his powers, so all he can do is defend to Teruki's annoyance. But while Mob can't physically hurt Teruki, verbally he's devastating. He may be socially awkward, but Mob understands more than anything himself, and in his eyes, Teruki is a reflection, someone who relies on their powers for everything, and Mob calls him out on it. Asks him why he looks down on others, and how it's clear to him that Teruki, just like Mob, is afraid of what he would be without his powers. And up until that point, Teruki is goading Mob into fighting him because Teruki hasn't fought an Esper stronger than him before, and it's clear that he's terrified of being displaced from the top by someone as pathetic looking as Mob. But at that moment, when Mob calls him out, Teruki loses his cool. Mob's display of his psychic powers that rival Teruki and then subsequent refusal to use them against the Esper creates such a disconnect in Teruki's mind that he tries to force Mob to use his powers on him to prove to him that he can't change as a person, that all Espers use their powers for their own good, incensed that Mob won't acknowledge him. And after an unfortunate and continuously humiliating set of circumstances, Teruki does something horrifying. He runs up to Mob, foregoing any psychic strength, and begins to choke him. And it's actually a really hard scene to watch because it's clear Teruki is in distress, and Mob is morally against using his powers to defend himself no matter how much Teruki begs him to do so. All he can do is throw a few weak punches in Teruki's face, which actually breaks Teruki the most. Watching this reflection of him seems so weak shatters Teruki's self-image. If Mob would attack him with everything he had, at least that would make sense to Taruki, win or lose, but this Esper telling him that he's average too is too much. Taruki screams at Mob, telling him that they can't change no matter what Mob says, pointing out that even though Mob works out, his punches are sad, do no damage to him at all, so why even try? And what's not said is that Taruki is so far up the pedestal of being special, told that he's special, believes that he is special, that he's terrified of being anything less. So, crying, Taruki chokes Mob, pleading for him to fight back until Mob stops moving. And the narrator voices over that they couldn't come to an agreement because they rejected both of their ideals. Taruki refusing to believe that anybody could change, and Mob refusing to believe that he can't. And that would have been the end of Mob Psycho if it wasn't for one last quirk to Mob's power. You see, it's not just Mob's emotion that makes him powerful. There's something else inside of him, something alien and at times terrifying, another entity entirely that appears in the form of question marks. And it fights back. And at first, Taruki thinks he's won because even though he's bald and naked and lying on the floor, he's forced Mob to use his powers on another person. But the victory is short-lived because that entity utterly decimates Taruki to the point where, in a beautiful shot, Taruki, after screaming and pleading in a moment of clarity, comes to peace with himself and admits that compared to that monster he sees on the ground, he's not special. He's just an average person. And the beauty of this fight is that not only does Taruki, the bad guy, lose and grow as a person, but Mob grows too, because even if it was indirect, he still used his powers on others, a situation that brings him to tears, 100% sadness. But it's also an important lesson to Mob as he slowly has to accept situations like this, where he is forced to use his power, will become more common the more he interacts with the world, and there will be points where he will have to fight, and he needs to come to terms with that, regardless of his ideal reality. And that's not just lip service, because Mob Psycho loves to show actual change. The horrific changes that the villains undergo, the more self-indulgent their ideologies become, and the more disturbed they appear, and the commanding heroic changes of flawed characters, believing they can be better and being badasses all because of it. It's more than clear in their voices and their animation, a dichotomy forming in this show. Speaking of which, we begin to see the fall of Mob's brother, Ritsu, halfway through Season 1, after he's mistaken for Mob and presumed to have psychic powers. He's recruited to a special training program, but try all he might, he can't so much as bend a spoon with his mind. Until it's revealed to him from the egging of a resurrected Dimple that negative emotions can fuel his power, and he begins committing acts, abuses of power as a student council member to fuel his self-hatred and allow him to use his powers. And like Taruki, Ritsu reaches a point where he believes there's no turning back for him, that he can't change back to the better. And he's almost happy, because it means he doesn't have to try or face the consequences of his actions. He doesn't have to think of the lives he's ruining, which are in themselves a discussion to have. But Ritsu, try as he might, wasn't meant to be a bad person. He wallows in a pit of self-loathing, hurting innocents and even his own student council president accomplice, but Ritsu is actually called out by a reformed Taruki, who has genuinely become one of the greatest proponents of the ideal that power isn't anything and that just by having power doesn't mean that you are special. And he extends a hand to an overzealous Ritsu and shows him how much of a gap between the two of them there are, just like when Mob taught him. And when Mob finally realizes what Ritsu is doing, instead of holding Ritsu to the same standard or question why he's beating up a bunch of gang members in an alley, Mob is proud of Ritsu for finally getting his powers that he's always wanted. And even when Ritsu says a bunch of terrible things to Mob to try to provoke him, Mob easily calls them lies and even apologizes to those Ritsu was fighting to try to get him out of trouble. a display of unconditional faith and love, and a great sign of emotional maturity from both Teruki and from Mob, two people who are shown that they can grow and don't just simply make stupid decisions once they understand the consequences of their actions and their choices. But despite all of that, apologizing and confronting Ritsu, it's not enough, because Mob Psycho's world has opened up far too much to be closed on good faith. The subtle world building of Mob Psycho really shines at this point, because after the fight with Teruki, word spread of Mob moonlighting as a ruthless gang leader called White Tea Poison because of how brutally he humiliated Teruki. A set of events that happens so naturally that it makes absolute sense, but you don't think about it until the consequences of the actions actually unveil themselves. Some saw Mob's actions as a challenge to prove their fighting skills, and others saw his powers as something for them to take. And because of the meekness of Mob, they all think that White Tea Poison, the strongest Esper in Salt Middle School, is actually Ritsu, and they want him at all costs. Enter the final arc of Season 1, and Scar, the accumulation of this season and everything we've learned. A sect of a large organization trying to create psychic powers to rule everything and everyone because they deserve it. And one does an amazing job making these people feel both real and childish, despite most of them being adults. Their genuine connection with each other, their ideologies and insecurities, and their very clear scars. People who reject society for whatever reason and purport to be above it, to be better than it. And they believe Ritsu is better than it too. So they kidnap Mob's brother, or they certainly try, because for the first time, while conscious, Mob comes to the conclusion that he needs to use his powers on this Claw agent to save Ritsu. And he does. Oh boy, he does, reaching 100% and demolishing the man, despite everything he throws at him. Though Mob's lack of ruthlessness and experience does catch him off guard, and Ritsu is still taken. So despite everything, despite breaking his own code and fighting with a huge percentage of his power, Mob still fails. But unlike before, he's not alone. Though Ritsu is taken, Teruki and a slightly worried Dimple, who is currently trying to gain Mob's trust to eventually manipulate Mob into starting a new cult to rule the world, but that also offers a voice of encouragement to Mob to seize what he wants and be more active in his choices and stuff. Don't worry about it. Not important right now. Comes to Mob's aid, and the three begin to raid Scar's headquarters with the plan to use Mob's power against any unbeatable enemy. And there's some amazing fights in this sequence and great comedic beats, and also a clever use of different powers all around. In general, the power system of Mob Psycho is incredibly diverse, if not incredibly expounded upon, but that just makes all of it more interesting to me. But it all begins to take a toll on Mob. He's beaten, psychically tortured, put under incredible stress where his failure will result in the deaths of his friends and family. And Mob Psycho does something I didn't think it would. It addresses that even though Mob has all of that power, even though he has a responsibility to use it appropriately, he's still a kid. He shouldn't be there, fighting insane adults with psychic powers. He shouldn't have to hurt or kill people to save his friends. And we see his stress levels go up as the fighting increases, up as his friends scream for him to go all out, up at the realization that they could all die, up as he decides that he'll do it, up as he believes that he has no choice but to kill them all, up.
やめとけモブ、お前が苦しくなるだけだ。嫌な時はな、逃げたっていいんだよ。
Reigen Arataka is one of the most unique characters I've ever seen. I haven't talked much about him in this review yet, because he usually plays off in the sideline, offering Mob advice in some comedic moments, and a place to hone his powers. But it's not that simple or easy. As I mentioned before, Reigen is a con man using Mob for his psychic powers to actually take out real spirits. Because Reigen has no psychic powers, despite lying to Mob over and over again that he does. He can't even see weak spirits. But he does see Mob. And in Mob, he sees someone with a unique and usable skill, not a get-rich-quick scheme. He's an assistant who can do the work that Reigen can't. He's a child that lacks the confidence and charisma Reigen has, and somewhere along the line, Reigen felt a responsibility to that child that he met on that faithful day. A connection through their weird psychic world, real or fake, that makes them unlikely friends. Reigen, despite being a con man, is a moral realist and a genuinely good person. He lies and scams, but he always makes sure the people he scams get something out of the exchange, so long as they operate in good faith. He doesn't overcharge, and he outright refuses payment if he believes he didn't do a good job. But Reigen is not universally capable. There is no major threat he could possibly face without Mob, and most times he's just plain lucky with how things turn out. But he has a belief that, despite his inability to face real threats, to face Scar of all things, he's still the adult in the room, and it's his responsibility to keep his students safe. So with the sheer force of personality, he infiltrates Scar's base, manages through a series of only nat 20 persuasion checks, wins the entirety of Scar's foot soldiers to his side by unintentionally convincing them he is their famed boss, and by displaying an amount of human dignity and kindness to the members of Scar which they simply did not know. But that's his charm and his weakness. Reigen has such a faith in logic and the rule of society, in the ability to work things out peacefully as adults, that he often overestimates the rational capacity of the psychics he and Mob face, often putting himself in danger. But he never backs down. Like the Body Improvement Club, he will drop kick or sucker punch anyone who threatens Mob, and he will willingly take any burden he sees weighing on Mob, regardless of whether or not he actually has the capability to carry it. Reigen is not perfect. He is vain, he is a blowhard, and he is a con. But in a room full of people screaming at a child to kill, to do something that will destroy his psyche completely, Reigen is the only one to snap him out of his intent and to give him another option: to run. And as unrealistic as it was to suggest running away, Reigen meant it wholeheartedly, because at the end of the day, he's not wrong. It's not a child's responsibility to fight adults, to ruin themselves because those who should be the voice of reason in society are too caught up in their delusions and fantasies to see the real damage they're causing to others. But Reigen, out of any person in Mob Psycho, is an absurd rational. In that moment, like the fateful meeting so long ago, Reigen gives Mob a different outlook, and Mob gives Reigen the strength to keep moving forward. Because in that slap, Mob transferred all of his powers to Reigen for a brief moment, and Reigen does something worse to Scar than kill them. He absolutely psychologically destroys them, and some physically, by using Mob's power to show how trivial their abilities are compared to, well, him and the grand scheme of things. Reigen at first calls their abilities cheap tricks and appears unfazed by every single insane attack they do, and after realizing Mob transferred his powers to him, proceeds to, in the greatest anticlimactic ending to any fight possible, point out how Scar are just a bunch of children running around with knives playing dress up, and how they plot to take over the world without having even seen the world yet. And when they ask if they should just return to being commoners, Reigen explodes on them, telling them that they're already commoners, because even with his power, Reigen is still a commoner, and he beat them all. So what the hell does that make them? And in the most satisfying rant I've ever seen in anime, Reigen dragged these comical villains out of their delusions and into reality by force. Just like Mob did with Teruki, and just like Teruki and Mob did with Ritsu. And it's a wonderful and cathartic thing to see these villains fully understand the folly of what they're trying to do. And of course, the only person who in the end of this doesn't take Reigen's advice and still lingers in their delusion is this weird little baby man who cries in an intimidating villain monologue that he should be worshipped and put on a pedestal because anything else would be too cruel and unbearable in this world. And the rest just dismiss him because a person like that won't change. And Mob tells him he's wrong. Psychic powers don't make you popular at all. Of course, Grandpa here doesn't take it too well, so the ginger kid that I never mentioned before snaps his spine and bolts. But that's a piece for another day. And so, at the end of the season, we must circle back around to the question, can people change? And in this case, did Mob change for the better or for the worse? And the amazing thing about this show is that there's not an inherently right answer. Mob did become more social, ending this season with friends and familiar relationships far stronger than he started, and formed not out of happenstance, but his own actions and their consequences. But Mob also had to compromise. He couldn't keep his ideal, refusing to hurt humans with his powers. Yes, he might have been backed into a corner on that front, but it doesn't negate the fact that he still betrayed his own feelings. Maybe the important thing is that realization never crippled Mob. He accepted the fact that he failed, and he still didn't resort to violence as a first measure. But he's no longer afraid to fight when his family is in danger. Whether that's a good thing or a first step to something terrible, we'll have to wait and see. And finally, Mob's empathy and kindness, one of the few constants we have throughout the season, did buckle under the weight of immense pressure. The idea that he would have killed all of those people if Reagan didn't stop him. It's a terrifying thing to think about, counterbalanced with the realization that, well, he didn't kill them. He, like Reagan, forgave his enemies after the fight, taught them that they could change, and we even saw the result of that change. Haruki, who is one of my favorite characters in the entire show now. So, in the end, I think it's clear that regardless of Mob's shortcoming, he did change and allow others to change for the better. And the nuances of society, of how no one deserves to be special, better than anyone else, earned their themes and their conclusions in the finale of the season. And what I love is, even more than anything else that happened in the end here, is that all of the morality, the questions, and the lessons learned in Season 1 are carried to Season 2. But again, that's a video for another day. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it at all, please consider liking or commenting on anything else you'd like to see me review or anything you thought about the review itself. And if you enjoyed the review or even take a look at my channel and enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. I'm on the road to 200 subscribers, and I'm hoping to hit it by the end of the month. And it's only possible if people like you enjoy what I do. And I hope you do. So, yeah. This was the longest review we've ever done on the channel, fully edited like this, and it was a ton of work, so I'm totally interested in hearing any feedback you all have or anything you'd like to see in the future to make this channel something better, something special, and not just a simple hobby. So yeah, if you enjoyed anything in here, anything at all, please consider subscribing, and maybe you'll even catch me on a stream day, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. But that will be the end of this video and of my little self-promotion. My name is Lachlan Star Eyes, and I truly do hope to see you next time. Bye-bye!